So welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the missing piece, how new homes can help save our schools from declining enrollment. This event is an important part of SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month. So each year in May, SV at Home invites our region's community partners to host dozens of workshops, webinars, and community engagement opportunities to educate and activate advocates and residents around housing challenges and related issues facing our communities. We're excited for a great conversation tonight. I'm Allison Singalani, Policy and Research Senior Associate for SV at Home, and I'll be your moderator tonight. I'd like to introduce our speaker and our panelists. So first we have Steve Levy, the Director and Senior Economist of the Center for the Continuing Study of the California Economy and member of Palo Alto Forward. CCSCE is a private research organization that works with public agencies and nonprofit institutions that need an explanation and analysis of California growth trends, including detailed projections and the implications for public policy. Steve is the author of a recent report in partnership with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and Palo Alto Forward and SV at Home that shows that thoughtfully planning for new housing development offers an opportunity to stabilize local schools. He'll be sharing some of that research with us tonight. On our panel tonight, we have Peter Ortiz, the president of the Santa Clara County Board of Education. Prior to his service on the County Board of Education, Peter served on the board of the Mount Pleasant School District and as public policy advisor for the Alum Rock Santa Clara Street Business Association, was the architect for the East San Jose Small Business Relief Program, a main component of the East San Jose Rescue Plan. When he's not serving the public, Peter spends his time working as the manager of provider strategy for Year Up, a national nonprofit that connects young adults to training and internships in Fortune 500 companies and to address intergenerational poverty in our working class communities. He's a staunch advocate for education, families, and affordable housing in San Jose and the county. Next, we have Jennifer Dibrienza, Vice President at the Palo Alto Unified School District Board. Jennifer's career as a teacher began in the New York City public school system. She spent 8 years as an elementary classroom teacher and staff developer for grades K through 8, and then became an education consultant for schools and districts in the US and internationally. In 2008, she graduated from the PhD program at Stanford's Graduate School of Education and has since worked locally, teaching at the Stanford GSE, consulting for education technology companies, and supporting teachers and administrators in schools and districts across the Bay Area. In 2016, Jennifer was elected to the Palo Alto School Board. She currently serves as board vice president and serves on the district's LGBTQ committee. Finally, we have Kenneth Rosales, SV at Home Planning Senior Associate. At SV at Home, Kenneth is focused on issues of land use and planning, including the housing element, a process each California city and county completes every 8 years, and all our Bay Area cities are completing right now, that works to help the city understand the housing needs in their community, identify locations in the community where the development of new homes could help meet that need, and create conditions to make that development feasible. Prior to joining SV at Home, Kenneth worked with the city of San Jose for more than 5 years, implementing environmental compliance programs with the Planning Division and the Environmental Services Department. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve now. Steve, why don't you kick us off tonight with an overview of your research?
Thank you, Allison. As Allison said, every city in the region in 2022 is updating their housing element. That includes, and this is relevant for the panel discussion, identifying sites where sufficient housing could be located, developing programs, because it's been really hard for cities, even the ones that are trying, to provide incentives that will meet the housing goals that the state has given us to reduce overcrowding and cost burden and increase affordability. And finally, to implement the state's fair housing goals. As Allison said, we're partnering with SV at Home on a grant to help residents engage in their community's housing element update process. One of the unanticipated findings, and the reason we're meeting here tonight, is that enrollment declines, which have been projected in the future because of falling birth rates, have actually been happening before the pandemic. And Allison will go over some of the research that she's done that shows that not only should districts be planning for a drop-off in enrollment, but many are also experiencing it now. There's three reasons, I think, principally why school districts and parents ought to be interested in engaging in their city's housing element update process. The first really relates directly to declining enrollment. You're going to want to have sites selected by your city in their housing site inventory that can help prevent school closures, because as the panel is going to tell you, those are disruptive to the students who may have to move out of their neighborhood. They're disruptive to the district, which will face facilities and staffing problems. And so you want to use the site inventory to minimize the prospect of future school closures. But there are two reasons that don't really directly to school enrollment. One is that the state and the region have given us goals to increase diversity, to provide for as many low and moderate income families as we can, to be housed in communities where their children can go to good schools. So even in districts that aren't facing school closures, you're going to want to engage in the process to make sure that there are housing sites for low and moderate income residents in school areas that will benefit from more diversity. And the third one Allison touched on, and it's really important. I hope the panelists who work in schools can tell you about the detrimental effects of housing instability and housing insecurity. It really diminishes, I think, the educational opportunities for the children and puts pressure on the districts who are having to try and educate students who are facing a myriad of challenges. So those are three reasons from me in our research for school districts and parents to get engaged. I'll now turn it back to Allison, who can share some numbers.
Thank you, Steve. Next slide, please. So Steve's research documents a state's pretty dire forecast for student enrollment in the South Bay, driven in large part by the shortage of housing and especially affordable housing. We know this isn't a new problem. I'm sure many of you have experienced this in your own communities, whether as parents or educators or concerned community members. In fact, my daughter's middle school in Alum Rock School District was consolidated with another school just this year. So we wanted to take a more detailed look at recent trends in school enrollment over the last 7 years. What we found is that K through 12 enrollment countywide has fallen 8% over the 6 years from 2014-15 to 2020-21, our current school year, which is a loss of more than 35,000 students across the county in just 7 years. Countywide enrollment has declined every year since 2015, and 25 of the county's 26 public school districts serving elementary students have seen these declines. Elementary schools serving younger children, if you take a look at the K through 5 enrollment here, elementary schools serving younger children are seeing larger declines. So we're seeing that younger families are hit harder. There's a narrative that public school enrollment declines are something new, and that, perhaps they're driven by parent dissatisfaction with school closures during the pandemic, leading to parents pulling their kids out of public schools and putting them into private schools. So we looked at the data to see if this is really what's happening. And what we discovered is that, first of all, the trend began before the pandemic, and that both the county's public and private schools lost students since the pandemic began. So since 2014, Santa Clara County's traditional public schools have lost 35,717 students. Over the same period, the county's private schools, which educate a much smaller percentage of our children, have lost 2,260 students. In fact, elementary school enrollment has declined across traditional public schools, charter schools, and private schools. Both public and private K through 12 schools are losing students, while K through 12 charter schools have grown only 1% since 2014-2015. Steep declines predate the pandemic. As I mentioned, the final pandemic pre-pandemic enrollment census showed that we had a 12% countywide decline over that time period, with almost every school district affected. Next slide, please. So this decline really hits both wealthy school districts and those from lower income communities. So the left column here shows school districts ranked by the percent of their enrollment decline from the hardest hit to the best. And the right-hand column shows the percent of students in that district eligible for a free or reduced price meal. So we're kind of using that as a proxy for the amount of money that's present in the community, the amount of resources that are present in the community. I want to point out that this is a little misleading here on the declining enrollment side, simply because since only 2 school districts do not have declining enrollment, it makes some districts green, not because they're doing well, but because they're not doing quite as badly as some of the others in terms of enrollment. So we see 2 groups of schools here in the right column with the highest enrollment declines. You'll see these that have green in the right-hand column that are wealthier districts, where home prices have grown so high that even many relatively well-off families have left the area. And the poorer districts like mine, with red in the right-hand column, where families that may have been just hanging on at the edge have finally been pushed out, as the housing shortage pushes relatively higher income people into competition with relatively lower income people for those scarce, more affordable homes. So on the next slide, so what's ahead? So looking at the forecast, this information is from the state, what the state expects based on the trends and additional data, is that elementary school enrollment will continue to decline an additional 13% over the next decade. And K through 12 school enrollment will decline an additional 15% over the next decade, a loss of more than 41,000 more students. Next slide. So what's the connection with housing? And why do we think housing is part of the solution? Since 2010, our region has experienced a phenomenal economic growth, driven by the innovation and the strength of our vibrant workforce. That workforce needs somewhere to live, but since 2010, our metropolitan area has added only 1 home for every 7 new jobs. That has contributed to a shortage of housing that's driven rents up more than 75% and median home prices up more than 300%. We don't have enough housing for all of us. All the people who contribute to the South Bay's vibrancy that we want, we need the homes for us to live in. And young families with children are one of the groups of people that's been hit hardest. Next slide. So let's take a look at how that plays out in a city, we'll just pick one, and a school district with some similar and some different challenges. So first we'll look at the city level at Cupertino, a relatively high resource community. Cupertino has great jobs, safe communities, good access to healthcare and parks and amenities, strong public education. This is the kind of community that we want lots of children to have access to, as Steve discussed, both because it leads to great life outcomes for them and selfishly because their great life outcomes contribute to stronger communities for all of us. Instead, we're losing elementary age children. I want to note that we're focused on elementary age children because they're really a harbinger of what's to come in enrollment in our middle schools and our high schools. So by looking at what's going on in elementary schools, we can see what's to come. As those children flow out of Cupertino schools, so does the state funding needed to pay teachers and staff, maintain school facilities, and invest in education. Since fewer students means less money from the state, declining enrollment can have dramatic impact on the budget. Over time, the inability to maintain enough students can lead to school instability, including the loss of our beloved teachers and school staff, disruption to the school community, as childhood friends leave for areas that are more affordable, and ultimately even school closures. We know, many of us know the pain of that disruption. We do know that some wealthy school districts have a different funding mechanism that isn't tied as directly to student enrollment, but these districts still suffer enormous disruption to the school community from the displacement of students, families, and teachers, and school staff caused by declining enrollment. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at my home school district. So pretty different story than Cupertino. Alum Rock Union School District is in East San Jose. We are a community that is primarily working class. Our district-wide elementary enrollment has fallen 26% from 2014-15 to 2021-22, so very similar to Cupertino Union School District enrollment. Elementary enrollment has declined every year since 2015. In the next slide. All but 2 of our elementary schools have seen enrollment declines, everywhere from 3% to 48%. ARUSD has almost 2,000 fewer students than it did 7 years ago. And I want to put the slides down now and take the discussion to our panel. So thank you, Peter, Jennifer, and Kenneth, for being with us tonight. I really appreciate your sharing both your expertise and your time with us tonight. So thank you so much. We'll start with the first question here. We've heard about the agony of school closures and consolidation. Some of us have experienced that. Staff reductions leading to the loss of prized teachers and district budget crises. Can you discuss the impact that declining enrollment is having, particularly for Jennifer and Peter, on your schools and the schools around the county? Peter?
Sure, great. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here for this important discussion. The declining enrollment in Santa Clara County is having a significant detrimental impact on the way our schools are obviously being funded, staffed, and resourced as we've come out of the pandemic. As mentioned earlier, the declining enrollment is, as we experience declining enrollment, we continue to face fiscal pressures at our school districts, as state funding is tied directly to the number of students our schools serve. In my trustee area alone, which is trustee area 6, consisting of the eastern portion of Santa Clara County, we've seen districts be forced to close schools in some of our most impoverished areas, with some school districts having to close multiple schools in 1 year. This has a disproportionate negative impact on our working class students and our students of color. We've also seen school districts tighten their belts in other ways by not providing much needed wage and benefits increases to their educational staff for the increasingly hard job that they do in a career that is already underpaid. This has made it extremely hard to retain quality and high-performing staff in our classrooms. This too has been in school districts that serve our children who have some of the most significant barriers to their success. There has been even cases, without naming names, of districts where districts have gone on multiple years without providing wage increases for their staff. And in more severe cases, there's been even downsizing, which then increases class sizes, also increases burnout for our teachers, classified staff, and makes it increasingly difficult to provide an equitable education for our students. The worst part of this is that downsizing in response to enrollment declines does not necessarily lead to budget savings for our school districts. Most of the district revenues, as they decrease each year when enrollment declines, but it's difficult to shed costs at the same rate. Some costs are fixed, and districts are forced to spend the same amount on services regardless of the enrollment. Therefore, as mentioned in Allison's comments, we're seeing a major disenrollment of students. And from now until 2028, we're going to be seeing a predicted loss of 30,000 students. This will not only require schools to close across the county, but we'll also see school districts have to close and collapse altogether. So this is an issue that is affecting everyone in the education community, every parent, and every neighborhood significantly, and one that I'm very passionate about and happy to be here to speak about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Jennifer?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me here. As in Palo Alto, we are community funded, so we are funded a little bit differently, and we have that privilege that it's not exactly the same situation. And yet the declining enrollment really impacts us in a number of ways. Right now, we're down several thousand students in the same time period you just talked about. I've been on the board for 5.5 years, and in that time we're down more than 2,000 students. And as a result, several of our elementary schools, we have 12 elementary schools, and several have gotten really, really small, to the point where it's challenging to keep those schools open, right? So we haven't made any decisions yet about school closures, but if this were just a blip, we might be able to ride it out. But when you look at those numbers over the years, it's something that's not only going to continue, but going to get worse. And so we need to think about, what does this mean, right? How can we keep 12 elementary schools open? Is that fiscally responsible to do? And if you do close them and you look at which ones are the smaller ones, at least for us right now, those are ones that disproportionately are going to impact our lower income, more marginalized communities. Additionally, one of the reasons people move to Palo Alto, or any community that they choose to move to for schools, is the benefit of a neighborhood school, right, where you can walk or ride your bike to school. And we have a huge proportion of kids, even at the elementary level, that walk and ride their bikes to school, which is wonderful. But when you end up closing neighborhood schools and kids now have to cross major thoroughfares or train tracks to get to school, no longer are they going to school with kids in their own neighborhood. And sometimes it's a lot less safe. And for kids whose parents can't necessarily walk them or drive them to school, it's putting kids at risk, safety at risk to get to schools that are farther away, just so that we can keep critical mass in our sites. The other thing that comes to mind that is impacting some of our sites is we have more and more multi-age classrooms. And one of the schools in our district is a choice school where multi-age classrooms is the norm. That's sort of one of the points of the school. So that's great if it's intended. But when you don't have enough third graders to run a second class and you have to combine them with the second graders, that just makes it harder, right? It's another pressure point, like Peter mentioned, on teachers who have had exceptionally challenging years. And now suddenly they've been a teacher of a single grade for a number of years, and now they're teaching multi-age because there are only a handful of kids from each grade at a site. So there are several, although they're not all exactly the same, even the community funded districts really have challenges that come along with this declining enrollment.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So we know that we're in a housing crisis that's impacting families and community institutions at every level. Can you talk a little bit about housing instability, the impact that housing instability, like the rent burden, overcrowding, displacement, and rising homelessness, has on educational outcomes and performance, and the school, student, and community stability?
Yeah. I'll take that one first, since you went first last time, Peter. This is something that's really concerning, I think, as a community, right? We have a school district that has about 10,000 students, and each school is a community in and of itself. And we have many families over the past several years, certainly exacerbated during the pandemic, but was happening before that and is happening now, that are trying desperately to stay with their community, right? And stay with the resources they have and the connections they have and the friends that they have. And when you have an unstable housing situation, not only is it really hard to do well in school because you don't know where you're going to be sleeping, or you don't know how long you're going to be in that housing situation, but there's been a lot of times that we've then lost families, right? Families that we've had tight connections with, that have known what resources were available right here in the community, that had family friends that could help out when they needed it. And suddenly they had to go somewhere else because they no longer could make it work here. So that's a loss for our own community, losing these families that were an integral part of us. And for them to now go, not only are you losing your home, but you have to go find a new place and build those new connections up. And if you are just struggling to make ends meet as it is, that's another added pressure on our families. So that's been a really hard loss for us over the years. And seeing families that have been desperate to keep the roots that they have made here, and to see it get harder and harder, and then families have to go, is really a shame for our community. Additionally, the other component that is not disconnected to that one is our diversity goals, right? We have a pretty diverse school district, as I think many on the peninsula do. But we've heard from a lot of our Black and Latino families, well, we haven't just heard from them, they have told us that because the numbers of those populations are low, our Black, our Pacific Islander, and our Latino communities, for a lot of students, they might be the only of their own identity in a classroom or in a grade or at a school site. And the more this house exists, worse that seems to get. And it's really hard for us to continue to provide a safe and welcoming place for every child when they feel like sort of the only of whatever it is, they are. So that's been another challenge in meeting our sort of those diversity priorities.
Thank you so much. Peter, would you like to share on that?
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who has personally experienced housing instability, this issue is truly pertinent to my role here in public office. Housing instability, rising homelessness, and chronic absenteeism for students of any duration has a major impact, negative impact on their educational outcomes. In our county, housing instability alone can be linked to chronic absenteeism, lower graduation rates, and higher suspension rates among students. Affected students were also disproportionately Latinx, Black, and English language learners. Housing instability in student populations make them up to 6 times more likely to be chronically absent from school and 4 times more likely not to graduate high school altogether. That to me is just shocking, and how a student's education outcome, right, can truly be determined by circumstances that are outside of their hands. Doesn't matter how much they study, how hard they try. If a student or child does not have solid housing, that is a key indicator of their ability to achieve in the classroom. Homeless students have a obvious higher rate of chronic absenteeism of any group. 40% of homeless students were chronically absent and were 2.5 times higher than the statewide average. That being said, a growing body of research suggests that stable, affordable housing would increase students' opportunities for educational success to combat this housing instability. Affordable housing can reduce distractions such as, of course, housing instability, chronic absenteeism, the overcrowding of a house. That's something that occurs very common here in East San Jose, multiple families living in one home. Students do not have a quiet place to do their homework, unfortunately. That's something that made digital learning extremely hard during the pandemic. And then affordable housing also relieves stress for families who are living paycheck to paycheck. A supportive, stable home can truly make a world of a difference for a student, and it will provide more of a nurturing environment to benefit their education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we know, anyone who's been in a community meeting recently knows that community pushback on new residential development can be intense. How much recognition is there about that you've seen about the connection between new housing and new affordable housing and the challenges faced by the schools? Do people get it? Has the school community been engaged in the housing element discussion at all? And if not, what do you think are the barriers to that?
I could talk a little bit about this. Unfortunately, at least in my area in East San Jose, where I'm most active, there hasn't been much connection between new housing and the challenges faced by our schools. People just, unfortunately, they do not get it. Many of the individuals that I have engaged with that come out in opposition to housing, mostly affordable housing or long-term sustainable housing for our homeless population, they do not have school-aged children. They're mostly empty nesters, or they've forgotten truly the importance of why it's increasingly pertinent to have a strong education system in our area. Many fail to see, how our school districts are tied to our economy, and how the success of our communities rely on a fully funded school district. In regards to school communities getting involved in the housing element discussion, or just housing discussions really in general, some organizations have been involved, such as organizations that advocate through educational school districts like Somos Mayfair, Latinos United for a New America, and a few neighborhood associations. They've come out to housing element discussions. But I personally would like to see more of our school board trustees, right, who are elected officials on behalf of our community, who should be advocating for the best interests of our students and our families, as well as parents who have young kids in our school district, and teachers and educators, because at this rate, our future generations who we are educating today will not be able to afford to live here in the communities in which they're growing up, let alone our entire education community whose jobs truly rely on school enrollment, right? Because as our schools are closing, those are teachers, staff members, counselors who will be losing their job. So yeah, those are my thoughts. In regards to getting them involved, I think our trustees and our superintendents really need to take the leadership as key figures in the community to voice their support in favor of both all varieties of housing, affordable housing, but also market rate housing, as a way to increase enrollment in our local school districts. And hopefully that will change public perception of this negative stereotype of affordable housing.
Thank you,
think,
Peter.
Sure. It's a political landmine, right? This is something that gets a lot of feelings on all different sides. I think that our school district itself, I haven't spoken with anyone explicitly about it recently, but I think that they try to say that's for politicians and whatnot to figure out. And we're not going to advocate one way or the other. I do think you're right. It's really up to trustees to really advocate for this. I think it goes without saying that I'm here as an individual trustee, not as speaking for our school board. I am quite sure that our entire board does not share exactly my opinions on housing and declining enrollment. But I do think it's really important that if we are serious about the equity work we talk about doing, that housing has to be a part of that conversation. And if we want to talk about the diversity in our community, housing has to be a part of that conversation. I do think you mentioned the housing element, and interestingly, our housing element, when it started, gosh, was it 2 years ago now when they were first putting together the committee? Maybe it was last year? And there was talk of having someone from the school board on the housing element. And I was really excited for that and asked our board president if that happened, if I could, if he would consider appointing me. And when the housing element was created, there was no spot for school districts. And I don't know if that was intentional or if that just happened, but it was disappointing because obviously whatever gets decided in the housing element has a huge impact on our schools and all of our students. So I do think that it would benefit the school district and the city in general if someone from the school district were served on the housing element. I think there's a lot of pushback for lots of reasons against housing at all levels of affordability. And a lot of times people who are against housing cite schools as a reason why, right? What they're trying to protect. And I think conversations like this are really important because there is little evidence to support that is true, right? That there's really a downside to schools if more housing is built. Now, of course, where, Steve had mentioned before, thinking about where those sites are matters, right? Students that live on Stanford campus come to Palo Alto Unified. And as Stanford was going through their general use permit, they were thinking about where they wanted to add housing. And the schools closest to those sites already are pretty full schools. And we have schools elsewhere that might be on the verge of closing if we don't figure something out or change boundaries. So the where really does matter too. And I think that those are conversations that would really benefit the housing element to include the school district in, hey, we're thinking about these sites. What would that mean for you?
That's great. Kenneth?
Thanks, Allison. Kenneth Rosales, one more time. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm with SV at Home, Planning Senior Associate. So we've been actually engaged with some school leaders in the county, in Santa Clara County, and we've learned that there's a pretty broad spectrum in their willingness to engage in the housing element. For example, on one end, if a district hasn't experienced an overwhelming enrollment decline or outcomes like school closures in their area, then their engagement is less likely to happen. And some have even mentioned fear of community backlash for bringing more economically diverse communities or economic diversity to their neighborhoods. On the other end, some school leaders are more proactive and observe what's happening in other districts with enrollment decline as potential foreshadowing of what's to come in theirs. On the flip side of that, some leaders are experiencing steep decline. Closures have happened, are ready to get engaged, and they're ready to get engaged and are distraught with the absence in coordination with cities and their housing element processes. So another interesting thing from our engagement has been that their initial reaction is often, oh yeah, we need more teacher housing. But as our discussions got a little deeper, the topic moved to how we are losing students and that the students desperately need greater housing stability. Folks get that this can be a touchy subject, but some are definitely looking for a way to engage.
Thank you, Kenneth. So this next question is a kind of a housing element question, and Steve, feel free to jump in on this one too. Steve and Kenneth, housing element planning process is a plan for more homes. We know some cities are working hard to ensure that they plan in a way that doesn't actually create opportunity for new housing. Even in cities that are taking this seriously, certain neighborhoods, typically wealthier single-family neighborhoods, are being kind of walled off through the planning process from new housing opportunities in general and affordable housing development sites in particular. These are some of the areas where school enrollment declines are most pronounced. What are we seeing on the ground in terms of the housing element planning process and the way that sites are being distributed equitably across the city?
In most communities, there are people who oppose housing for a variety of reasons, some of which they have their facts wrong. As for example, we've been talking about that actually housing will help school districts, but some are simply opposed. One of the points of this event and our general work with you on engagement is that there are a couple of obvious communities that should be supportive of adding housing of all types. One is parents and school district trustees in districts that are facing school closures, housing instability, and disruption, which is why we're having the event tonight. Another, and it's been strange to me even in my city, where very strong environmental advocates don't get that if we build more housing on the peninsula in these communities closer to jobs, that some families won't have to commute 90 miles each way. That not only will their kids be in better communities with high amenities, but which actually will reduce congestion, local air quality, and make some contribution to greenhouse gases. And so I'm not so much thinking that we're going to be able to convince people who are opposed and just make up reasons. What I'd like in our engagement is to mobilize people who should easily see the benefits for equity, the environment, and their students of building more housing, particularly housing for low and moderate income in their communities. That's my perspective.
Thank you, Steve. We had a comment in the chat that that in one school district, parents are more focused on making sure their kids are educated in a COVID-safe manner and may not feel like they have the bandwidth to think about the housing element. So I think that is a legitimate point, and that we can help by creating entry points where it's a little easier to figure out what to do next. Kenneth, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. So, this housing element process, particularly in this cycle, with all its new requirements, is it's large, it's long, it's really complicated, and short. Cities can't do it all, so it's essential that they have robust and transparent public participation processes that are in collaboration with community-based organizations. So, unfortunately, we're just not seeing that level of coordination in most cities. At the moment, the process is being used more or less as a checkbox in a business as usual kind of way, which is unfortunate because it's a real opportunity to do something different and actually see the outcomes. Also, our region is actually in a really good situation where we can learn from the mistakes of other areas that they're making throughout the state. So, for example, only 7 of 19 cities in the San Diego region have housing elements that have been certified by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. I'm going to just say HCD for short from now on. It's a mouthful. The Los Angeles region only has 17 of 197 cities with certified housing elements by HCD. So when cities submit their housing elements to HCD, they send it back. HCD sends it back to cities, to get it closer to being right. And this gives cities many opportunities to get it right. Most of the comments that HCD is making on the housing elements are on affirmatively furthering fair housing, city sites inventories, and also public participation. And this school enrollment decline paradigm hits on all 3 of these pieces. For example, cities can ask themselves, how can we ensure that struggling families have access to affordable homes throughout their community so that their kids can stay in the South Bay? How can we ensure that the opportunity sites they have identified will accommodate affordable housing so that kids don't have to study in their cars? And how can we ensure that we understand the housing needs of the community at large by reaching and engaging with a large diversity of people, including our school leaders and perhaps even lived experienced families? So I think those are some pretty good questions that cities can ask themselves throughout this housing element process.
Let me make one more point, Allison. As Peter said, the housing element update process with the state is probably going to go on for at least 9 months or a year. This is the first event that I know about that's tried to bring together school people to talk about housing. We're going to have a lot more opportunity because this is going to be going on in cities, as I said, for 9 to 12 months. I think this is a start to build on, but I wouldn't write it off as a failure simply because there are not many school district or trustees that have seen this connection. This is brand new to them, and I think we should keep plugging away at it.
There's one thing we know about organizing, it's that it takes time. It is time and labor intensive for sure. Thank you, Steve.
I think Steve made a really good point there. I think that for a very long time, trustees have had the attitude of, we will educate the students who come to us, and that is our job, and that's where our job stops. And in some ways that's very true, but when the students that are with you, you are losing those connections because of the lack of housing options. I think that there's an opportunity there to talk to trustees about really what their role is in advocating for the students they have now.
Thank you. I think that's super important, Jennifer, especially given the role of cities as kind of central institutions. This is, in many cases, our schools are why people choose to live in the communities that they do, which makes the success of schools really critical to the success of cities, and really gives school communities a great footing to demand that their input be considered in the housing element in terms of citing to support school enrollment. So what are the key things cities should be doing differently to plan for realistic, feasible residential development throughout their jurisdictions? And how do we know when they're taking this seriously? How do we make the case that we have to do this right?
Can we incentivize Matthew to jump in and because he's really been working on this for you all. Matthew?
Hi, Matthew. You've been pressed into duty.
Yeah, I think Kenneth and I have been working on this pretty intensively. There's a lot of cities in the county, so it's a lot to keep track of. I think and I'll turn it over to Kenneth in just a second, but part of it is just kind of watching the process. And I'll just say from the outside and our efforts to engage and bring local community folks into the process, it's been very frustrating. I think it's safe to say that 80% of the public engagement has probably happened in the last couple of months, even though it was supposed to happen starting 18 months ago. So one is just, how seriously everybody's been taking the requirement to really get public input through the different stages. And it hasn't been good. And to be fair, it's a heavy lift. But there's also this process of identifying actual sites for real housing that are likely to happen. And Kenneth has been working much more closely, looking at the material that the cities have been providing on that piece. Kenneth, I don't know if you want to share some reflections on when it looks good and when it looks like they're not really trying hard enough.
Yeah, I mean, just responding to Allison's questions, I think that the city's actions need to match the severity of our situation in the Bay Area. They need to dedicate themselves to meeting the requirements and the intent of the housing element process, and not treat it as something that they kind of, pretend to do or go through the motions. Instead, they actually can try to make sure that they have an impact. This time around, the housing element is very serious, and in most cases, the rules are really clear about realistically and feasibly planning for residential development, especially for lower income units. They need to follow them, and the only way they're going to meet them is if they are intentional about it. Otherwise, their shortcomings are going to be obvious, and they're going to be seen in bad faith. HCD will be all over it, and we'll send it right back to them with swaths of revisions to make until they get it right. So also, there's a really very important new thing with this cycle's housing element process is that there's an enforcement division under HCD now for this process, and it's going to hold cities accountable, and folks like us will be right there observing and coordinating with both cities and the state to ensure that the housing elements are implemented. So I think leaders have a great opportunity to speak up about getting these housing elements done correctly. And by correctly, I mean taking that bold and decisive step towards housing justice for our families and our students. Rather than enabling the fear that makes people resentful of change, leaders can provide, on the flip side, the courage to pilot our collective vision of an accessible, affordable, and equitable housing future. So it really is in our collective interest to do this right, to create opportunities, to do the work of assessing and responding to housing needs, and to evolve. We need to grow, and we need to do better than what we've done in the past. And sometimes these discussions are difficult and tense even, sure, but if we commit, we can do great things, and that are really responsive to the diversity of the community's needs and their interests.
Thank you, Kenneth. You actually kind of hit on the next question a little bit there. I just want to acknowledge in the comments, we have a comment that it can take forever, that someone has been on the request list for the below market rate housing in Palo Alto for more than a decade. waiting for that. So, clearly that really speaks to the shortage and how much more we need to meet the need. So, this question is really for Jennifer and Peter at this point. What is the role of education leaders at this point? What would it take to get the school community engaged?
I can start, but as I mentioned earlier, and I don't expect to snap my fingers and all of a sudden every single elected trustee in Santa Clara County to become a housing champion. But I do think that we should, as education leaders, understand how housing and access to housing and making sure that students have a stable place to learn and live does directly tie into the success of our students, right? And we need to make sure that as many as possible who are education leaders, whether they're school board trustees, parents, or education staff, that they're involved in the discussion for more affordable housing, because it's in the best interest of our students, their education outcomes, and their future here in Santa Clara County. Many factors that impact a student's success inside the classroom actually occur outside of the classroom, and the most pressing of these factors is housing instability. Therefore, we really should be as trustees on the front line if we are able to dedicate the time outside of work and our roles on the board, but pushing back against exclusionary zoning policies, advocating for more funding mechanisms at the city level to generate the resources needed to build affordable housing, and in turn improving the educational outcomes of our students. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to education staff, I see no bigger threat to their job, to their pensions, and to the wages than low enrollment. It's the elephant in the room, and the only way we can combat it is by making it more affordable here in the county. So I think that SV at Home does a great job facilitating these conversations. We should build on them. Maybe we can establish a committee group based on education leaders that advocates and organizes in our own area and shares resources and speaks at other events like this, because the only way we're going to build the momentum needed to change the tide, again, to push back on NIMBYism, is to fight it with YIMBYism. Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, as Peter said, a lot of what happens outside of the classroom really impacts the inside of the classroom. And so if your parents have to work several jobs so that they can cover housing costs, or if there is a lot of stress in your home about where you are going to be living, or if you are going to lose your housing, if you are trying to do your homework in a car or in and out or in a library late hours instead of doing it at home, in a home where you have space to quietly study, that's going to really impact your outcomes. Additionally, our teachers, and our classified staff, if they are traveling far distances, as you said at the beginning, I used to teach in New York City, and I taught in Manhattan, and for some of the time I lived in Brooklyn, and for some of the time I lived in the neighborhood where I taught. And if there was a play at night, or there was something going on the weekend, or someone needed me to stay after school, it was much easier to do when I lived in the neighborhood I worked than if I had a long commute home. And certainly if I trekked all the way back home, I was not coming back in that evening for some event at school. So the students didn't get as much out of me. I was just as tired, but at least when I lived close by, I could really do more and be around for more. And it connects you more to the community, right? You are a closer knit community when everyone knows everyone and sees everyone really outside of the classroom. We can better support our students, and it gives the teachers a better quality of life, which if you care about that in and of itself is enough. But even if you don't care about that, it then in turn provides a better experience for the students. So that's a big one. And one other note, even in Palo Alto, which I think comes with all kinds of reputations on their own, about 50% of our students we estimate are renters. It's 50% of our families. And so I imagine that number is even higher in some other communities. And so some of those families, I'm sure, are very secure in the housing they have, but that's a lot of people who are really impacted by the rental market and the housing stock that's out there to rent from. So I think when you look at the issues of equity, the issues of what factors lead to more success in the classroom, and the issues of staff impact, really it runs the gamut in the reasons that trustees really need to care about this issue and can really make drastic improvements for their students and outcomes in their schools if we do make progress on this issue.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. What a fantastic conversation tonight. I just want to, I am delighted to see in the chat that we have yet another school board trustee who is all in, yay. And also a comment about engaging staff and teachers unions on advocacy for more housing. I think we have time for one more question to squeak in here. School test scores often impact real estate values. How can affordable homes be included in those areas that are high performing so we can bring more equity to our educational system?
I mean, I think the conversations just have to happen about what does it mean? What does equity mean? What does it mean to have a diverse school system? How does it benefit everybody? The test score thing is tough. It's there are all kinds of biases embedded in the standardized tests already. They are a measure that we are measured by and that we have to deal with, and that's fine. I'm not going to say we should get rid of them, but in and of itself, that comes with bias. So I think the onus is on school boards and communities to really press for the benefits of a more inclusive community, right? And that's not just, it doesn't just benefit the people that are then allowed to stay. It benefits everybody when we are more diverse along all kinds of lines, when we have a diversity of experiences and thoughts and work, and when we have a more vibrant community because there's all kinds of people that live there. So I think it's sort of on the merits. I'm not sure the test score argument is going to get us very far, but I think really believing in equity and inclusion and putting our money where our mouth is.
Just to add on that great answer, Jennifer, I think it's really important for everyone to be involved in these housing discussions and for the cities to include voices outside of the traditional ones that fill those rooms. And that means renters, that means working class people who have so many barriers to civic engagement and civic participation. That's part of why I believe SV at Home is really advocating for people to get involved in this housing element discussion, because these discussions are the ones that determine in which neighborhoods the new development of housing are going to be occurring. You know, what specific zoning laws are going to be governing development in neighborhoods, right? We've seen how in the past single family zoning has, pushed a majority of affordable housing and dense housing in certain areas, and has kept areas essentially segregated, right? So it's these discussions that some people may find boring, or some people, a lot of people unfortunately don't have the time for, but that's why they're so important to attend, because while we're raising our families, while we're taking that double shift at the restaurant or at the hospital as we're working as a nurse, these decisions are being made mostly by people who have the luxury of time, and in many cases those aren't working people, those aren't renters. So unless we get individuals involved, we're going to continue to struggle with exclusive zoning in areas that are just not accepting of affordable housing.
Thank you so much. Really wanted to take the time to thank all of you. Steve, thank you for sharing your research. Peter and Jennifer and Kenneth, thank you so much for being part of our panel, and Matthew for being pressed into service. So now what can we do about this? So I'm so grateful to you all for attending. We have dropped 2 links in the chat here. One is for the Housing Element Engagement Toolkit. This is a collection of tools and resources to help folks get engaged in the housing element. You'll also see a link there for the enrollment research that will link to Steve's report that he shared some of the top line findings from. But really, I think a lot of what we need from school advocates who are also interested in housing as a tool to support schools is just to open up the conversation and to talk about how additional housing and planning for new housing in areas that can support our schools can make such an impact on our school communities. So as Steve said, this is the beginning of the conversation. This is not the end of the conversation. We look forward to robust and ongoing discussion. We look forward to really working together with our educational leaders to empower you with the tools that you need. And we need you there leading and guiding the conversation. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. We are recording this event, so we'll send this event out to all of our registrants tonight. It will also be on the SD at Home YouTube channel. We'll probably share that also with Palo Alto Forward, so we can make sure that we get that out to as many folks as possible. As I said, this is the beginning of the conversation and not the end. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.